Hello and welcome to episode 39, I think, of Question and Answer. And we're getting into high numbers, so my ability to count may start to falter pretty soon when we're getting up into such high numbers. I took math in school and I was able to count all the way up to many, but 39, it's many. That's many. And we got many questions too. And I do apologize for the hiatus. I went on a kind of vacation from YouTube, but now I'm back and I'm better than ever, sort of. So I'll just start answering questions here. And the first question is from Mary, spelled M-E-R-R-Y. And wait a minute. Before I answer Mary's questions, I want to address sort of a request. It wasn't a Q&A question. It wasn't exactly a Q, but it was a request with regard to Q&A from a monk who lives, I think, in Thailand. And he's either a Western monk. I assume he's a Western monk. If he's not a Western monk, then he is an Asian monk with a mastery of the English language. He didn't really specify what his ethnicity was, which, it's not really all that important. But he was asking me to do videos on how to make robes and like the proper way of going for alms round and so forth for monks, for ordained monks. And I know about this stuff, and I've been toying with the idea of writing an article on how to make robes, because most monks really don't know like the really ancient way of making robes. But it seems a little awkward to me to be giving instructions to monks on how to do their job when I'm not a monk anymore. But it is a good idea, and I think I'll eventually get to at least the robe one. He was asking me about a number of things. He was requesting that I do videos on that sort of thing. And it could be interesting to have a layperson, a guy wearing a shirt and all that, talking about the proper way of making monks' robes and so forth. As far as I knew, I was the only monk in all of Burma who was making robes like completely in accordance with the ancient rules of monastic discipline. But I can talk about that later. So let's get back to Mary here. And Mary's first question is, in Digha Nikaya 16, near the end, and Digha Nikaya 16, by the way, is the Parinibbana Sutta, which is discussing the Buddha's last days and his death. Anyway, in D16, near the end, the Buddha says, if it wishes, after my passing, the Sangha may abolish the lesser and minor training rules. Which of the rules are considered minor and which major? Well, if you continue reading it might be in the Vinaya, the Chulawagga, the official account of the first council, you may find that even the arahants, the 500 arahants who presided over this, did not agree on which rules are considered minor and which are major. At the very least, we can assume that the dukkha offenses, which are the lowest level of offenses, dukkha and dubhasita offenses, would be minor. If any rules are minor, it would be the ones, don't talk with your mouth full. Don't teach Dhamma to someone who has shoes on, which is broken all the time in the West. But there is a rule saying a monk should not teach Dhamma to someone who is wearing shoes. But just because in ancient India it was a sign of respect to take your shoes off when approaching a holy man or so forth. And so there's all these, there's lots and lots of them, hundreds of minor rules like that. And at the very least, those could go, I suppose. There were some, according to the official tradition, that there were some arahants who were considering anything except for the 4 parajikas to be lesser and minor, but no, I don't think so. Telling lies, drinking alcohol, killing animals, steal. Well, I guess stealing would be parajika, so long as it's above a certain value. So yeah, I mean, if even the arahants who are the Buddha's disciples could not agree, because it is vague. I mean, it's not saying anything below the level of pachitya offenses would be lesser and minor. But I mean, it's a safe bet to assume that the most minor ones, just going with severity, there's different levels of rules. At the very top, you've got the four parajika rules. And if any monk breaks those, he's just automatically excommunicated, even if nobody finds out. He might not even know that he's excommunicated if he's really ignorant of the rules. Below that, you've got Sangha Sesa, which are also considered to be garu or weighty, serious offenses. So I assume those also wouldn't be lesser and minor. And that would include, fondling a woman with one's mind perverted by lust, or masturbating to orgasm, having an orgasm on purpose, talking dirty, lewd talk to a woman. There's a few obscure ones, like siding with a monk who is causing a schism, this kind of thing. Yeah, those are serious. Below that, you've got tula chaya, which, I mean, the word tula means like, weighty or heavy or serious. So tula chaya offenses also probably are not lesser and minor. And that would include such things as trying to commit a parajika or a sangha offense and then failing, or like eating human flesh, I think, is a tula chaya offense. Cutting off one's own penis is a tula chaya offense. There's not a list of them in the text, but you have to kind of look around every once in a while, especially in the ancient commentary, which is now canonical to the Patimokkha rules. It's mostly any monk who's trying to commit one of the really serious ones, the first two categories, but fails for some reason. That would be tula chaya. Then below that, you've got pachitya, which is in two groups. You've got nisagiya pachitya and just regular pachitya. Nisagiya pachitya means before you can confess the offense, you have to get rid of whatever it is that you are possessing that is not kosher. And one of the main ones is money. For a monk to own money or have it in his possession is a tula chaya or a nisagiya pachitya offense. He has to relinquish the money, and then he has to make confession. If you make confession without relinquishing the money, it's just invalid. It has no effect. And so, I mean, maybe pachitya, but even pachitya offenses, that includes killing animals, telling lies, drinking alcohol, this kind of a thing. So my own personal guess would be, it would be dukkha offenses, and dubasita offenses. And there's only one dubasita offense, and that's making a joke at somebody else's expense. So yeah, that's what I would say. And then there's one more category, and I'm pati desaniya, and there are very four obscure ones, and nobody breaks them anymore. I think at least one of them has to do with a bossy bhikkhuni, like the monks are invited to a house, or they're eating in public somewhere, and you've got a nun who's like bossing the lay people around, telling them, you should offer more of that and less of this, and this kind of thing. And the monks there have to tell her to be quiet. And if they don't, they've committed an offense by not telling the nun to be quiet because she's being bossy with the lay people at mealtime or something. But as I say, those never get broken anymore. So I think I answered that one. You got lots of questions. I probably shouldn't be going too in depth on some of these. So I'll just move on to Mary's next question, which is a question that Mary asked last time, which somehow didn't get on the list. And Mary asked, I mean, it was sort of like a raunchy joke was included in the first version of this question, and I couldn't find it. I mean, Mary requested that I include the original version of the question with the raunchy joke, but I seriously could not find it. It's like YouTube has these weird things where comments will appear and disappear. It was like that. So anyway, Mary's second question here, this is the redacted, repeated version. What are your thoughts on realms of existence? Can it be explained within just the human realm? I mean, maybe an addict can be considered a hungry ghost. A deva is someone like rich and famous movie stars. Some poor people are born into circumstances that clearly resemble hell, and humans are like normal run-of-the-mill humans. Well, I mean, you can say that that humanity is sort of like a microcosm of some of the main realms in Buddhist cosmology. Maybe, there might be no sphere of nothingness, the devas existing in this formless Brahma realm, the sphere of infinite consciousness or something. Um, yeah, they might not have representatives in the human race, but it is true. I've noticed myself that, I mean, there are some places that are like hell realms, like some like crack houses or something. I've been in a few places. I've never been in a crack house, but there are some places you go there and I mean, it really is like hell. I would assume some mental institutions might be kind of like that. Some old folks' homes are kind of like that. But nevertheless, you could sort of use it as an analogy for the human realm, but that's really not what the 31 planes of existence are really referring to. That this universe is very, very big, and there's all kinds of beings. I mean, like animals, obviously. Those are, of all the 31 planes of existence, aside from the human realm, animals are the most irrefutable, because they're obviously here on the planet with us and are visible. You can, touch them and weigh them on a scale, that kind of a thing. So, yeah, I mean, you can say that some people are like devas, divas, which means God. Some of the beautiful people. I've heard some Hindu guru or swami was talking about how like Marin County, California is kind of like a deva realm where people are out, drinking their lattes and doing yoga on the beach and all that kind of stuff. But again, the 31 planes of existence are to be taken literally. And so there are just I mean, anything you can imagine is existing in this universe somewhere, somehow. And a lot of things we can't imagine are also out there. And it may be that the heaven realms and the hell realms, for example, are not exactly like they're described in the books. But I'm fairly confident that there are, heaven-like realms that are like better than the one we're in now. And then there are worse ones. So I'll just move on to the next question. And this is with regard to one of the earliest videos I ever put on YouTube, the Sermon of the Stinkwood Tree. Maybe if I think of it, I'll leave the link. Otherwise, if you go to my videos on my channel, my YouTube channel, and just scroll all the way down to the bottom to the ones that were made in 2011 when I was still in Burma, hadn't come back to America yet to seek my fortune. There's this one called the Sermon of the Stinkwood Tree, and I had just finished going for alms. I was a monk at the time in Burma. Just finished going for alms, and I had these plastic bags. Chut-chut-8, they're called in Burmese. It's polypropylene. It's the ones that are photodegradable, and they're called chut-chut because they make the crinkly sound. Anyway, I'd go for alms, and I was relatively famous as a monk in that area. So I'd go for alms around. There'd just be a long line of people. And each person would get to put in like one little cup or one spoon, depending on how many there were, of rice and a little bit of curry. But sometimes they'd want to offer like a banana or like some bread or a piece of cake or something, fruit, any kind of fruit really. And it just wouldn't all fit in the bowl. I've got a big bowl. I mean, that bowl back there holds more than a gallon. But still, when 60 people are all wanting to offer food and you got bananas and stuff, yeah, it just wouldn't all fit. So I started carrying a plastic bag to have the extra food and just put the extra food in that. Not extra rice and curry, but just the, the cakes and the cookies and the fruit and stuff. So that's what it was. And then I just, after I'd get my bowl put back into the bag, I'd walk back to my cave and eat my food. And so I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Pseudonym. And again, I'm guessing that Pseudonym is not his real name. And Pseudonym says, one very simplistic critique of Buddhism is noting the contradiction that you desire to not desire. Similarly, practicing Buddhism to reduce stress, be happier, or even to seek enlightenment as an achievement to tackle are misguided. Yet enlightenment remains as the target or perhaps the object of desire of Buddhist practice. Is this a real contradiction, or in what ways is this critique missing the mark? Can you help untangle this knot? Well, not all monks, let's just set aside the drones and the clowns and the crooks and, just lazy people that, they're not really even trying. Just set those aside. They do exist in the Sangha. We'll just ignore those. But even the seriously practicing monks, not all of them are like striving for this goal of nibbana. Because some of them, it's just they feel like it's a duty to practice. It's like their sacred duty to practice Dhamma as well as they can. So that is, that's like their goal, is just practice as well as they can. Some people, they just like to meditate. They like to live a simple, austere life. That was pretty much my situation. And so they just practice because of that. I have warned for many years. Beware of goal-oriented Dharma. If you're not in the present moment, but you're like aiming at something in the distant future or maybe even the near future, as long as you're not here in the present moment, then you're not practicing correctly. If you're doing this in order to get something later, then yeah, you're already misguided to some degree. Which reminds me of, I think it's one of the last, I can't remember what they're in Spinoza's Ethics. He's got it set up like Euclid. So it's one of the last theorems or whatever it is that you prove in geometry, that virtue is its own reward. You're not being virtuous in order to get into heaven or whatever. It's just virtue is its own reward. And Dhamma practice really is its own reward. And so long as you retain that kind of attitude, your Dhamma practice will be more fruitful, I think. Not that you should be doing it in order for the Dhamma practice to be more fruitful. But still, there are a lot of monks who are striving ardently, earnestly for nibbana or nirvana or enlightenment. And the thing is, the more you progress, and we'll get to this later on, there's another question, if I remember correctly, that kind of applies to this, where if, let's say, you're striving for enlightenment, just single-mindedly, and so all your other cravings kind of go away, or they're sublimated, or they're just, rejected or whatever. You've got this one craving left. You don't crave girls anymore. You don't crave rock and roll and ice cream and partying with your old friends. You're not craving the book collection. All you want is enlightenment. And so you've reduced the number of your attachments and desires down to this one big one. And then you try and you try and you try, but because you still have this clinging, you can't become enlightened, because that's like your last obstacle. So eventually you get to this point. It could be like an insight moment where you just realize, you just let everything go, or it could just be like absolute despair. I just can't do this anymore. You just kind of cast it away, and that's it. You've thrown away the last attachment. So enlightenment can happen that way. So on the one hand, you're better off not setting up a goal as a purpose for practicing. It works for some people, I suppose, if we go to the second route that I just explained, where it's this thing, this last attachment. You sublimate all of your other attachments for this one holy, sacred ideal. And then, of course, because you have the attachment, you can't get there, you can't attain it. And then finally, for whatever reason, positive or negative, you cast that aside too and click. So that can work too. But yeah, desiring not to desire. I mean, it can kind of work. It can move you in that direction. But of course, obviously, if you're desiring not to desire, you're never going to reach non-desire until you eventually cast aside the desire not to desire. And that may be at a relatively advanced level. So that can happen too. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from, I'm pretty sure his name in English is Yuichiro, although his name is in Japanese letters, or what do you call them? Something grams. I don't know. What are Japanese letters called? Kanji. There's kanji, and then there's like one or two other ones. So anyway, Yuichiro, I think, says this. And some of these questions I haven't even read yet, so this is almost like I'm being live streamed and answering questions that way. This has been suggested before, but maybe there's some way Buddhism can be modified for the West. I've heard suggestions like fusing Buddhism with native paganism like it did in Asian countries. Unfortunately, European paganism is basically dead, and I don't see it coming back. Christianity has to be contended with. Semitic religions are intolerant and must either absorb or destroy other religions like the Borg. I'm wondering if there's any way for Buddhism to coexist with Christianity given this fact. In China, Buddhism and Taoism coexist. Similarly, in Japan, Buddhism and Shintoism coexist, but neither Shintoism nor Taoism are as completely intolerant of other religions as Christianity. It's also possible that Christianity will die out given its incompatibility with science. Its central claim is an empirical claim for which there is no evidence. However, the anti-globalist right is Christian dominated, and I want them to win for political reasons, even though it's extremely unlikely. But if they win, Christianity will be dominant again, and most of these people are definitely for a theocracy and banning other religions. Do you have any thoughts on this? Call it the final solution to the Christian question for Kex. Well, surprisingly, the monastic schools of Christianity, which in the West is mostly Roman Catholicism, although there's also Orthodox Christianity, they are much more friendly towards Buddhism just because there's so much more overlap. When you get into Protestantism, I mean, one of the first things the Protestants did when they started up Protestantism was to just ban monasticism, which is practically banning the highest levels of the religious practice, of the spiritual practice, and just banning almost the more advanced spiritual development into like sainthood, that kind of a thing. So there are like religious conventions where Buddhist monks will be asked to come and give like sermons to Christian priests and monks, for example. I had a Roman Catholic priest come to my cave in Burma once, just dressed as a monk. I mean, he was ordained, I think he was ordained as a novice, even though he was still a Catholic monk. They're really interested in that because they like the meditation. They want advice on meditation. And most of the meditation, and I told this to the monk, I mean, to the Christian, or the Catholic priest, it's like, you know, almost all of the meditation techniques, you know, the basic ones, are included in Roman Catholicism. And why don't you just practice the Roman Catholicism, you know, the meditation and mindfulness and so forth in Catholicism? And he said that in Roman Catholicism, maybe it's this way in Orthodoxy too, it's more or less esoteric, it's secret. I mean, you have to be ordained into a contemplative order of monks or nuns in order to be taught the stuff. Whereas in Buddhism, it's for free. You know, you just someone can come in off the street and join a meditation retreat in some cases. So it's more available in Buddhism. But there is a lot of friendly feeling. And in Christianity, a lot of Roman Catholics, you know, like ordained ones, consider the Buddha himself to be a Catholic saint. Saint Josaphat. Technically, it was a previous life from a Jataka story that made it to Europe over the caravan routes. And this story about this saintly wise man, it was just considered to be true, and the Europeans just considered him to be so wise and saintly that he must have been a good Christian. So he wound up being canonized as a saint. So, I mean, there are certain schools of Christianity. I mean, we can set aside Unitarianism that accepts pretty much everything because they've just gone off the deep end lately. It seems to me politically, at least a lot of them have, whereas it's like leftist politics and New Age and LGBTQ stuff instead of the actual spiritual stuff that you would expect in a sermon. Another possibility would be some kind of Western philosophy, like a resurgence of, or just a reinvention of something like Stoicism or ancient cynicism. Something like that could be compatible with Buddhism. But the more fundamentalist sects of Christianity and Islam, yeah, I think Yuichiro is right that they wouldn't really be willing to play ball. And as for Jews in Buddhism, I mean, the Jubu, so-called, is a phenomenon, but it's not so much a combination of Judaism with Buddhism. It's just sort of like for the most part, just sort of like the socialist tendencies of a Jewish person who has abandoned religious Judaism, still has like the cultural aspects of some aspects of it, who then enters Buddhism and then just starts promulgating socialism and so forth. But that's not working. I mean, I'd say many or most of the people that watch these videos, they've got no use for that sort of thing, where you've got another religion kind of infiltrating Buddhism or even or essentially cultural Marxism infiltrating Buddhism and just completely mucking it all up. So yeah, I mean, realistically, I don't see Buddhism integrating with Christianity in the West. I mean, there could be sort of like a friendship pact where they both agree, okay, you're better off religious, trying to be a good person, trying to do the right thing, than just being a complete degenerate. And they do have like these world religious forums where people come together, and the Dalai Lama speaks, and the Archbishop of whatever speaks, and they're all like agreeing, and not very much ever gets accomplished, but at least they're showing friendship towards each other. But I think the only way Christianity would adopt Buddhism would be in parts and pieces, where they're just adopting the meditation techniques or whatever. So, but I mean, that's kind of the way it's going in America anyway. So yeah, it's I think the best thing we can do is just wait and see what happens, because something's going to happen. You just have to wait and see. Or if anyone has any brilliant ideas on how to make it happen, then you can do that too. But I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Weird Flex. I guess this is like some kind of slang that I completely missed out on because I was in Burma for 30 or 20 something years. Weird Flex. I guess it's some kind of actual word. So it's really not this person's name. And Weird Flex says, what is the shape of your practice today? You've written about mindfulness in the mundane, but does your Dharma practice extend beyond that? Are you continuing to chant, meditate, or observe uposatha? Well, with regard to formal meditation, like sitting cross-legged, I don't do it anymore. I honestly confess. And the reason for that, plainly stated, is I got as far with it as I could, even when like I was a full-time meditator. Meditating several hours a day, I just got to this point where I would have to try hard just to stay where I was. It was like the Red Queen in Wonderland who has to run as fast as you can just to stay in the same place. And as a layperson, just part-time meditator, sitting cross-legged, I wouldn't come anywhere close to some of the mental states I cultivated very strenuously when living alone in a cave in a forest in Asia. So, yeah, though I don't do formal sitting meditation practice anymore, although I still do mindfulness and like oming. Oming is just some weird spontaneous thing that comes up with me sometimes. So I can be oming spontaneously, and I do chant a little bit. I've chanted the Metta Sutta. I've blessed the metal shop where I work, um, chanting the Metta Sutta there quietly. When I'm just closing and there's nobody else there, and observing Uposatha. I think today is Uposatha, the full moon day, but I don't behave any differently on Uposatha days, so I don't really observe it. I may acknowledge that it's Uposatha. That's as far as it goes. So mainly what I'm doing is I'm just trying to apply what I cultivated as a monk to a life in a more blatant version of samsara. It's all samsara. Even a meditator's cell is samsara, but I'm sort of at a more advanced level, or it's like a more challenging level, more difficult level, I should say. And I'm just doing the best I can. Obviously, I haven't totally abandoned or forgotten what I have learned. So I'll just move on to the next question. And Weird Flex's second question: what was your closest brush with death? Which is kind of an interesting question, and it's surprisingly difficult to answer because sometimes you don't know. I've come close to car wrecks before. I'm like, usually when I was a teenager and drove like a maniac anyway, you can be doing 70 and hit a patch of black ice and just start like spinning down the highway and that kind of thing. I've done that a couple times. Whether that was my closest brush with death or not, I don't know. The first time I got malaria, I was pretty messed up. The second time I got malaria, when I wasn't nearly as sick as the first time, I had like a fever of 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Yeah, I was very sick the first time. If I hadn't taken the pills, then I certainly would have died. Probably I had malaria like 7 times, always the worst kind. Probably every time, if I didn't take the medication, I would have died from it. So it could be that. So it'd be my closest brush with death that I know of. Who knows? Maybe a bullet just missed me and I wasn't even paying attention or something. But yeah, it'd either be the first time I had malaria or one of the times when I was like a teenager who drove like a maniac and almost got in just a huge car wreck. One of those times. So I'll just move on to the next question. And this is from Johannes. Or Johannes, I think. And Johannes says, I was wondering, how is just noting, like it's often practiced in the Mahasi tradition, compatible with noble effort, where you should stop a negative state of mind as soon as it arises and generate good ones? Well, the two are, they just overlap. This kind of noble effort. In Mahasi tradition, they also had what is called heroic effort, which meant that you just keep meditating no matter how bad the pain in your knee is or in your hip or your ankle. Even if you think you're going to die, then you just keep sitting there meditating until the hour is up. But here the noble effort is just if you start having an inappropriate or unskillful or unwholesome thought, you just note it and let it go. That's Mahasi tradition right there. And just note it, let it go. Note it, let it go. Whatever arises. It can be even wholesome thoughts. You're thinking, praise the Buddha or whatever. Just note it, let it go. Whatever arises, just note it and let it go. And letting it go doesn't mean just flinging it away from you in aversion. It's just let it go. So it wouldn't be, I mean, the good thoughts that arise here in Ioannis's question, where you should stop a negative state of mind as soon as it arises and generate good ones. I mean, the good thought is just the mindfulness. I mean, that's the good mental state anyway, because all thoughts, you just note them and let them go, note them and let them go. So let's see. So I think I answered that one. So I'll move on to Ioannis's next question here. And Ioannis says, my second question would be, what are your personal thoughts on the Vipassana movement that has established itself around the teaching of Goenka? I find the teaching in the way of practice very appealing and in line with what my personal spiritual development has been like. But then again, they seem to be very discriminating against any other tradition, which basically means everything that isn't Goenka from as far as I can tell. Do you have any personal experience regarding them and their style of practice? Well, I've never attended a Goenka retreat. I've known a lot of veteran Goenka meditators, some of whom became monks. And I've read a few of Goenka's books. You know, I know what it's about. I've had it explained to me by people who have done it, that kind of thing. And one of the last monasteries I lived at in Burma had a Goenka center right next door. Yeah, I used to say that the Goenka people were like the Jehovah Witnesses of Buddhism, because it is really true. They have sort of a, you know, ours is the true way. You know, ours is the only way. And I've been told that among the Goenka people, if some veteran meditator drops away, you know, he tries some other tradition or something, he just gets shunned. Like in the Jehovah's Witnesses, where they just get shunned. You know, they just, you don't talk to them. You know, they're just dead. So there is that. Although the Goenka method obviously appeals to a lot of people all over the world because it's very successful, and to their credit, they don't charge money for their retreats. They just say, you know, if you think was of value to you, then, you know, if you donate money, you're helping the next person. You know, if you think it's good for somebody to be able to do this without having to pay for it, and you know, you can pay for, you know, somebody, the next person who comes along who's be sitting in your spot, that kind of a thing. And it is very simplistic. So a lot of Goenka meditators, you know, or I should say a lot of Western monks start with Goenka and then they move on to something more multi-dimensional, more well-rounded. Because Goenka really is, it's like a stripped down version of Theravada. It's in some ways very simplistic. And I'm skeptical of how far it can take you in meditation. The very fact that they are sort of Jehovah's Witnessy, kind of almost like fanatical about their method. Like I've seen that the Goenka tradition, the Goenka organization, the Goenka system published their own version of the Pali Tipitaka in the original Pali, and the teachings that were like emphasized by Goenka himself were all in red ink, which is kind of strange. But I would say that it's a good method to start with. I mean, a lot of people get a lot out of it. I've talked to a few people that, you know, their lives were changed for the better just from doing a Goenka retreat. So, I mean, just sitting there 10 days of intensive meditation for someone who's never done it before, you know, they might be all messed up and they're finally having to look into their own mind instead of outwards at their phone and the TV screen and all the other stuff. They're just turning inward, introspecting for 10 days, just rigorous. And the Goenka method does emphasize discipline. It's not like you can meditate when you want and walk back and forth when you want and, you know, go do your other things when you want. It's not like that. So it's good as an elementary introduction to Buddhist meditation. And it may be that, I mean, it may be good up to an intermediate level, but I really don't think that it really contains within it the most advanced teachings, or at least the most advanced levels of progress in meditation. So I think I'll just move on to the next. I mean, with regard to how the Goenka method is conducted, you'd probably be better off just reading up on it or something. It's like the standard retreat. It's like the first third of it is like samatha, where you're just watching the breath, and then after that you're doing body scanning, where you're just your body is divided up into parts. You just like your head area. You just wait until there's a sensation, like a bodily sensation there, and then you note it, and then you move on to the next part of your body until you feel something there, and you move on to the next. And it's not really described that way in the Pali texts. It's just sort of a variation on some kind of mindfulness. But yeah, I mean, if you're really interested, my best advice is go do a 10-day course. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Austin. And Austin says, thoughts on the mind being an epiphenomenon? Well, personally, I would say that the brain is more of an epiphenomenon of mind than the mind is an epiphenomenon of the brain. I guess for those of you who aren't familiar with the term or the idea of the mind being an epiphenomenon, there are scientists or philosophers of science or just philosophers who consider consciousness to be just kind of an incidental side effect of brain function. So it's an epiphenomenon. It's just sort of incidental, just sort of accidentally it has happened. But I mean, the brain still works, so it's not really a problem. But I'm not a materialist, and I think it's at least as true that the brain itself is an epiphenomenon of consciousness. There would be no brain if there was no perceiving consciousness to identify it. From the scientific point of view, it's hard to say really. I mean, does the mind itself, I mean, just setting aside brain function, I mean, does the mind add anything? Does it enhance brain function in any way? So I mean, I can adopt a scientific point of view. I have a degree in biology, so you can go into science mode or scientific realism mode, materialism mode, and try to explain things that way. And then, I mean, the mind being an epiphenomenon of brain function, of just electrochemical reactions in the brain. It makes sense from that point of view. Although I do not think that the brain creates consciousness. My scientific theory or hypothesis, I suppose, is that consciousness just pervades the universe. Is what a physicist calls energy is a very, very elemental, simple form of what a psychologist calls consciousness. The universe is conscious. It doesn't think, like a hydrogen atom isn't thinking. It's not sitting there contemplating or philosophizing, but it's just like this elemental spark of consciousness. And what a brain does, just again, going with the whole scientific realist paradigm, it does sort of to consciousness what a computer does to electricity. It doesn't create the electricity, a computer doesn't, but it takes the electricity and organizes it and complexifies it, if that's a word, complexifies it, and then utilizes it. And that's sort of what the brain could be said to do with consciousness, instead of just this unthinking primordial sort of consciousness. It takes it and complicates it and organizes it, and then is able to utilize that for the purpose of staying alive long enough to make babies. But personally, deep down, I'm just not a materialist, and I really think the mind is more real than the brain is. And I mean, it's just kind of weird that science will, I mean, some scientists, like the behaviorists of the 20th century, just rejected the existence of mind altogether. They just, it's just, I mean, they tried to just deny its existence, some of them. When obviously, I mean, the one thing that even the most radical skeptic has to acknowledge is the immediate experience of consciousness. I mean, if there's anything at all is real, then it's the subjective experience of consciousness. at least anything discrete, aside from the absolute. So I'll just move on to Austin's next question. And the next question is thoughts on Yuji Krishnamurti and his skepticism of enlightenment. Well, I really don't know all that much about Yuji Krishnamurti. I have a book by him on this computer, but I haven't read it yet. Almost all that I know about Krishnamurti is from a book called Goner. It was one of his attendants wrote a kind of autobiography about his interactions with Krishnamurti. And so Yuji Krishnamurti, not J. Krishnamurti, but Yuji Krishnamurti, I mean, he really wasn't extremely different from J. Krishnamurti. They both have this idea of it's almost like nihilism. It's like trying to live a religious life is, in a way, it's just kind of dishonest. It's trying to live up to ideals just leads to failure and hypocrisy. And I mean, even J. Krishnamurti talked like that. Yuji was even more radical. He was called a spiritual terrorist. And but with regard to his skepticism of enlightenment, that's kind of interesting, because although I haven't read about Yuji Krishnamurti's skepticism of enlightenment that I can recall, I assume maybe he's saying that there just is no enlightenment. And one of my favorite spiritual teachers who's still alive is Paul Lowe. He's very old now, and I think he's retired and isn't doing public teaching anymore. But he said the same thing, that there really is no state of enlightenment. That this is it. I mean, just the way we are now, this is it. Although he was considered by some to be enlightened, and Yuji Krishnamurti also is considered by some to be enlightened. In fact, his body apparently underwent a kind of like a return to a prepubescent state. It's like he lost his puberty or something when he had his experience. Yuji Krishnamurti, that is, not Paul Lowe. So I mean, yeah, there's something to the idea that there really is no state of enlightenment, because a state would be something samsaric, something within the context of this world, and nirvana or nibbana is just completely off the scale. So I can agree with the paradoxical idea that from a samsaric point of view, there just is no enlightenment, because ultimate reality, it has practically nothing to do with the virtual reality of having a body and an individual mind and thinking that you're separate from everything else and all that. It's just completely transcending that. And even an enlightened being, I mean, they still have the body and the mind apparently. And so it's like a paradox in Mahayana Buddhism, especially, where they're saying, well, there kind of is enlightenment, but there's no moment of enlightenment, and it doesn't actually happen. But it's still, I mean, you can't even say that it exists, because existence is part of this duality of existence and non-existence. So it's just completely off the scale. And so I can kind of grok it, kind of sympathize with the idea that in this world, in samsara, there just is no actual enlightenment. And from an unenlightened point of view, you look at an enlightened being, you're just going to be like picking apart the foibles that you perceive. And I mean, there's that too. I mean, even an enlightened being, let's just assume that somebody can become enlightened. For the sake of argument, let's just assume that there are enlightened beings. An unenlightened person looks at them, they're just going to see another unenlightened person, because they just cannot, I mean, they lack the sensitivity or the wisdom to get past the superficial human stuff. And, like Neem Karoli Baba, if anyone was enlightened in the 20th century, he'd be one of my main guesses. And he didn't act like an enlightened being. He'd just do mind-blowing stuff and just read your mind and all that kind of thing. But the rest of the time, he's just like talking and yelling and laughing and throwing things and hitting people. And he's still a human. It's like all the human stuff is still there. It's just he wasn't identified with it anymore, or some such. So I guess that'll be my answer to Yuji Krishnamurti and his skepticism of enlightenment. And so I'll move on to Austin's next question. And Austin says, can you speak on this accounting problem of unenlightened beings continually being born into human existence? Given infinite time, you'd expect there to be a lot more beings breaking out of the realm of samsara and not an increasing human population. Well, that's a good question. And I have considered this numerous times over the past decades. Buddhism teaches that the universe really has no discernible beginning. I mean, it's essentially samsara has been here forever and ever and ever. If it's here at all, it's been here forever, has no beginning, presumably no end. And there are beings that become enlightened. So you'd think that over an infinite period of time, if beings are continually getting enlightened, that samsara would eventually just empty out, that there'd be fewer and fewer beings, which apparently is not the case. So again, I mean, you can say that there's the paradox of enlightenment just not existing in samsara, which would prevent any being, at least from a samsaric perspective, from escaping. But there are a few non-Buddhist explanations that I find intriguing. And there are two explanations. I found them both in the same weird, mind-blowing book called Seth Speaks. It's written by a woman named Jane Roberts, who would go into a trance and channel this multi-dimensional being named Seth. And even if Seth was just like a figment of her subconscious imagination, and she herself would kind of toyed with the idea, still, I mean, Seth was saying like really profound, mind-blowing stuff. And so one thing Seth said in this book was that like a being in from a Buddhist perspective, I mean, the main element of an individual being is just the stream of karma, the stream of mental states, like volitional mental states. And that according to Seth, I mean, there can be like little streamlets that can split off from the main stream. And this little streamlet can just go off and become like a dog or something. In fact, Seth was claiming that he had deliberately split off part of his stream of volitional consciousness, his karmic stream, and to become a dog. So that's one possibility. I mean, you can have somehow the stream of karma, the flow of karma, the process of karmic mental states can just split and create two smaller beings somehow. But then he said something else in the same book that is intriguing to me, and I think it's possible. I mean, I'm not insisting that it's true, but he's saying that, like, for example, if you're dreaming at night, or if you're just like daydreaming during the day, you imagine beings that don't really exist. And it happens a lot. You can be talking to somebody in a dream, and that person doesn't really exist in empirical reality. It's just like your subconscious mind just sort of made up this person that might resemble kind of two or three other people that you know of, but it's not any of them. And you've created these beings in your mind. They've got like this shadowy, wispy, very faint kind of existence. But after you stop dreaming them, you've already kind of created this being that has its own new stream, and it starts off in this very, semi, sort of a semi world. It's just very tenuously got like a little toehold of some kind of samsaric existence, and then it just sort of builds up from there. Sort of like the Jains believe that like crystals and water or fire are like an elemental form of life, and then even that gradually develops into something more advanced. So, I mean, again, people that are here today weren't necessarily people, many generations ago. I mean, it could be that a lot of the people that are alive today were some sort of ghost beings or animals or something, which could explain why so many people nowadays, in the West at least, are essentially NPCs. That they don't have much originality or independent thought. They just follow along almost mindlessly with what everybody else is almost mindlessly following along with. So I mean, they may be coming up out of ghost realms or animal realms or whatever. But it is kind of an interesting um, idea, and it's one that kind of belies the whole Mahayana concept of, the Bodhisattva vows. I vow to liberate all beings. But I mean, this universe has been around for an infinitely long time, and all beings are not yet liberated, which indicates that all beings will never be liberated. But going with Orthodox Buddhism, some beings become liberated. And so either you've got an infinite number of beings that somehow, even though a few of them are fading out or going off the scale, it's just infinity is so paradoxical you can't wrap your mind around it, so that it could just keep going forever, and you're always going to have an infinity of beings, or new beings are being generated. And I don't know what the answer is. So I'll just move on to the next question. Also from Austin. And Austin says, I have heard monks from the Mahasi lineage, particularly Yuttadhammo Bhikkhu, say that samatha meditation can't lead you to seeing reality clearly, therefore it is not conducive to enlightenment and can only lead you to the Brahma realm. Thoughts on this? Well, if it doesn't lead you to enlightenment, then why would the Buddha have emphasized it as much as he did? He emphasized samatha more than he emphasized vipassana or mindfulness in the texts. Just going with the suttas, he talks more about cultivating samatha than he does about cultivating mindfulness and the vipassana that arises from mindfulness practice. And that, in fact, in the practically the Bible for the whole vipassana movement, including the Mahasi people, which is the Mahasatipatthana Sutta. And the Mahasatipatthana Sutta defines right concentration, sama samadhi, as 4 jhanas. So I think the Mahasi people who really, I mean, I've never heard of any Mahasi person becoming enlightened. It's like they get up to maybe Sakadagami, the second to lowest level of sainthood, and just kind of stay there. At least that's a common belief in Burma anyway. That the Mahasi lineage, it just doesn't lead all the way to enlightenment itself. So it's in a way it might be kind of sour grapes. It's like the Mahasi lineage, it started back in the 50s with Mahasi Sayadaw himself. And I mean, it was like mindfulness is good enough. You don't need to cultivate the jhanas, according to the Mahasi tradition. And they use some sub-commentary, an obscure statement or two in sub-commentaries to try to lend some like authority and legitimacy to this idea. It's the commentaries say you have to have at least, or at least they imply you have to have at least, what's it called? Neighborhood concentration, which is supposedly pre-jhana, but it's not mentioned in the suttas. Yeah, this whole thing has been a raging controversy since the 1950s, with the Mahasi people saying you not only don't need jhana, but you don't even need like access concentration or neighborhood concentration. And for some reason, the Pali term is just eluding me. But I mean, the Buddha did emphasize it, and there are texts. One of my favorites being the Lesser Discourse on Voidness or Emptiness in the Majjhima Nikaya, which explains how jhana can get you enlightened. And it's like the monk is cultivating voidness or emptiness. So the first thing he does is he moves out into a forest. He gets away from the village. He gets away from town where you've got all these, all this artificial junk that kind of obscures reality. You get out into the forest, so that's already, you've got more emptiness, more voidness than you did before. And then you start cultivating deeper and deeper meditative states. You get into like really advanced jhana states until finally you get to the formless concentration of mind, animeta chitta samadhi, which is considered to be just the highest mental state you can attain. It's above ordinary fourth jhana. It's like the highest state that you can cultivate mentally. And then the monk comes out of that, and then he realizes that even the highest possible cultivatable state has a beginning and an end, and it's conditioned, and it's just not it. It's not nirvana. And so that causes this click where you just kind of let go. I mean, you realize, it's not going to work. It can't work, because anything that you cultivate is going to have a beginning, and it's going to be conditioned, and it's going to have an end, and it's not going to be enlightened. So then you just let go, and then that's it. The click happens, and you're enlightened, supposedly. I think it is very possible that not everybody has to get to that level, but some people do. It's like some people, in Buddhism, it's not like you're going up this ladder or up this mountain until you reach the top, because there is no top. You just keep going up and up and up forever. There's no limit. So eventually in Buddhism, enlightenment comes where you just let go of the whole thing. You just bail out sideways. And some people, they can bail out sideways at a relatively crude level without having attained jhana yet. Whereas other people, they've got to get up to the level of the monk in the Lesser Discourse on Voidness, where you get to the highest possible level that you can attain, like with your meditative mind. And maybe, I guess you could say that's the top of the mountain, but that's still not it, because enlightenment is just totally beyond the top of the mountain in that case. But at least you have to get to that level in order to finally have the click and have enlightenment somehow happen. But yeah, the Mahasi lineage, they're really not in a position to say you can't become enlightened by practicing samatha, because they're not enlightened either. They're just, it's, in a way, it's kind of wishful thinking, sort of Mahasi favoritism. They just, that's their tradition and they're standing by it. But the Buddha did really emphasize the importance of jhana and just really subtle meditative contemplative states. And it's certainly going to help you. A lot of, especially Mahasi people, they'll say, well, you get psychic powers and from practicing jhana, and then it gets distracting, and it can just lead you astray and all that. But you have to be careful of that sort of thing. But still, the Buddha wouldn't have spent so much time teaching it if it was worthless, essentially. So I'll just move on to Austin's next question, which is kind of an interesting one. Can a psychopath become enlightened? And psychopath is kind of a vague term. Any kind of real weird person, like significantly weird, might be called a psychopath. So I'll just go with the term, I'll just redefine the question here as a sociopath, because I think the main definition of a psychopath is essentially a sociopath, which is a person who has no conscience, no compassion. They're just like completely like separate from everybody else, or at least like subjectively, they don't give a shit what anybody else feels. They're gonna just, hurt anybody, and they don't care. And, they have no remorse, no guilt over that sort of thing, no conscience, essentially. And I don't think a person like that, who's completely cut off with no compassion, could become enlightened, because enlightenment, in a way, it's like you're getting rid of all the walls between you and everybody else, and you're completely knocking down Pink Floyd's wall. Whereas a sociopath is just completely encased in this wall. They have no compassion, no empathy with other beings. They're just locked in. And so they're going to have to stop being a sociopath. before they can become enlightened. At least that's what I consider to be likely. I really don't have a lot of experience with sociopaths trying to become enlightened. I mean, there's Angulimala in the texts, who was a kind of serial killer who became enlightened, but apparently the Buddha was able to teach him in a way by just blowing his mind, essentially. Angulimala was chasing after the Buddha, trying to kill him, and the Buddha was just walking at a normal pace, and no matter how fast Angulimala ran, he couldn't catch him. And so that just kind of blew his mind. It was like this miracle happened, and then he, it's sort of like at least a little bit of Pink Floyd's Wall kind of fell away when his mind was blown like that, and then the Buddha could sort of penetrate and teach him something that would actually help him. And Angulimala eventually became enlightened. He was ordained as a monk, stopped killing people, of course, and became an arhat. But he had to stop being a psychopath or a sociopath, assuming that he was one, in order to really make spiritual progress. Because again, if you're going to become enlightened, you no longer have a sense of self. You no longer have barriers between you and the rest of the world, you and everyone else. And it seems to me that a sociopath has much stronger barriers than the average person. He's just isolated. So I'll move on to the next question. This is the last question by Austin, although not the last question by a long sight on this particular Q&A. And Austin's last question is, wouldn't celibacy lead to sexual repression and abnormal behavior among monks? Well, I mean, celibacy itself can be called a kind of abnormal behavior for an adult human. And it is true. I mean, at the very least, it's going to cause horniness among monks, like chronic frustration and horniness that can then, I mean, if it's bottled up, can then, sort of fester in the subconscious mind or deep down in the mind, and then come percolating up in the form of like hysterical symptoms, using Freudian terms, like neurotic symptoms. And I have some experience with that. So yeah, celibacy can lead to sexual oppression and abnormal behavior among monks. Although, again, this is a case of, doing something at the beginning. I mean, you might do it for certain reasons, and it's got a certain dynamic to it. But then as you make progress in Dhamma, your wisdom increases. And then eventually you see that, the horniness or the desire for sex or whatever, I mean, you can just let it go. I mean, it eventually, through abstinence, if you're doing it correctly, and maybe you just don't have a very strong libido anyhow, then you're able to repress it, go through like the neurotic, the hypochondria or whatever symptoms it is, whatever it is, and eventually make it through to the other side where you've had the insight where you can just leave it behind, and then, it's off to the races. So celibacy certainly does lead to sexual repression and abnormal behavior among monks. Just being a monk is abnormal, just going with human nature. But I mean, it's seen as preferable by a lot of celibate monks. It's seen as preferable to just, wallowing in sensuality. But for monks that have a strong libido, it can just be an ordeal. Seriously. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Nirmit. It's an Indian name. I'm not sure how to pronounce it correctly. Nirmit. And Nirmit says, I feel like jhanas are completely misunderstood by most teachers. What is being taught today as being a jhana is not the same jhana the Buddha was talking about. Any thoughts? Well, yeah, I think jhana has been misunderstood, and very early on, actually, before the texts were completely finalized, I think. So there's that. And then I've already mentioned a number of times that in Burma, probably most of what is called jhana is really hypnotic trance. Not all of it. I'm not saying all of it, but like even at some place like Doya, which cultivates jhana. I mean, that's one of the purposes of the method, is you're supposed to cultivate jhana there. But I mean, I've had a lot of talks with people that have meditated there. I've spent some time there myself. I've read at least one book by Paul. I've spoken with Paul, and some of the people there are just hypnotizing themselves. They're going into like a trance state and then thinking that they've attained jhana when I don't think they really have. Fourth jhana has been defined lately, or I mean, probably since ancient times, as a state where you almost stop breathing, your heart rate slows down, and you're just oblivious to everything around you. You're essentially like a hibernating squirrel. This is supposed to be the highest level of meditation, normally speaking, setting aside a few of these states that also get added or get mentioned sometimes in the texts. But traditionally, fourth jhana is supposed to be, the highest jhana. It's the highest one on the list. The number goes up to 4. And even the formless jhanas are supposedly just variations on fourth jhana. I mean, if it's like temporary liberation, which it is called, that jhana is temporary liberation, I don't see how being enlightened would be essentially being oblivious to everything around you and you're like a hibernating squirrel. So, yeah, I think that the 4 jhanas were originally just 4 stages of meditation, just 4 different levels of progression in meditation, where at the first jhana, you're meditating correctly, but you're still thinking, you're like labeling things, that sort of thing. And then second jhana, you're not thinking anymore, but you're still feeling mental and physical pleasure and pain. Then you get to third jhana, and you're still feeling physical pleasure and pain, but you're not feeling mental pleasure and pain anymore, like happiness, unhappiness, anxiety or joy or that kind of thing. And then fourth jhana, you're wide awake, you're just empty. You should be more awake than you are in your normal, working consciousness. But I mean, you've just risen above, pretty much all the ups and downs of the mental states and the sensations. So I do think that like scholar monks who've never really attained it, like the higher meditative states, they're like philosophizing about it and coming up with these schemes. They're trying to systematize it and nail it down as to it's this and not that. And I think a lot of them really didn't know what they were talking about, like the medieval Sri Lankan commentators, for example. So yeah, jhana is very much misunderstood. I think there's different levels of misunderstanding where, like even in ancient times, what was originally, in my opinion, probably just 4 stages in the progression of meditation, and not necessarily superhuman mental states. I mean, nowadays, according to Orthodox tradition, even first jhana, when you're still thinking, is a superhuman mental state. I mean, you're beyond ordinary human level, and for a monk to, I mean, it's forbidden for a monk to even talk about having attained it. And if he deliberately lies about having attained it, he's excommunicated for life. That's one of the worst things a monk can possibly do. But yeah, I already mentioned that the 4 jhanas are considered to be right concentration. The right concentration is defined as the 4 jhanas in the Mahasi Sutta. So it's kind of strange that superhuman mental states would be necessary to follow the Eightfold Path correctly. But yeah, it's really kind of messy. And then, as I also said, that a lot of people just kind of delude themselves into thinking that any kind of weird experience they have is like jhana or even higher. They think, some monk or even just a layperson, they're meditating and they have some kind of mind-blowing experience, all kinds of, mental fireworks or whatever, and they just think they've become a Sotapanna. They think they're an Arya or a Buddhist saint, or they've at least had second jhana or whatever. And yeah, there's a lot of that. And most of the people that I've met who consider themselves to be Aryas, in my opinion, are not. But I think I should just move on to the next question. This is from Jules, that ends in a Z, not an S. Jules, Jewelz, or a Z for those of you in in Old England. And Jules says, are there any comprehensive meditation instructions that are comparable to the Satipatthana Sutta to be found in any non-Buddhist tradition or religion? With regard to, like, I mean, the Satipatthana Sutta is like a condensed compilation of different meditation techniques. And I really don't know enough about other contemplative traditions to know if they have something similar in this condensed compendium of the different meditation techniques. But there are non-Buddhist texts that do give meditation instructions, like St. John of the Cross, one of my favorite non-Buddhist saints. Yeah, he had a lot to say about meditation and contemplation, which would be probably at least second jhana because you're not thinking anymore. And, you know, he gives advice that isn't even found in the text. Like, how do you know when to switch from meditation where you're still thinking to contemplation where you're not thinking anymore? You know, he gives advice on, when when you're ready, kind of a thing that is hard to find in the Buddhist texts. Hinduism, of course, has meditation techniques. I think just about any esoteric contemplative school of any religion that has an esoteric contemplative school, like Sufism, or probably even like in Judaism, you've got some kind of obscure texts that most people have never heard of that are giving, meditation instructions. Like, what is it? Saint Ignatius Loyola, um, the founder of the Jesuits. I can't remember the name of the book. I haven't read it, but I've been told that it's just, how to train a Jesuit priest or monk. And it's got all these guided visualizations and so forth that you have to do. But yeah, with regard to something as condensed as the Satipatthana Sutta, which is largely just a list of the various meditation techniques with like a synopsis of how to do each one. Yeah, I haven't read enough non-Buddhist texts like along those lines to really be able to say. Although Saint John of the Cross does that kind of thing, definitely. Although he's not giving a condensed list. He's just giving meditation instructions and contemplation instructions. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Chakra Gosha. And Chakra Gosha says, how do you know which syllable to stress in Pali? The rules are different in pre-classical Vedic Sanskrit versus classical Sanskrit. In Vedic Sanskrit, as in Greek, you have to learn where the stress goes for each conjugated form of each word, but in classical Sanskrit, as in Latin, you can always tell where it goes based on the shape of the word, heavy syllables, and whatnot. How does it work in Pali? For example, definitely should be Siddhartha Gautama he's got like the little accents showing where the verse or the stress goes in classical Sanskrit, but I really have no idea where to put the stress in Vedic or in Pali. Well, it's in Pali, like in Pali poetry, for example, it doesn't even go by stress, which is something that's hard for me to fully understand. I don't fully understand it, but it goes by length or shortness of vowels. That's how the cadence of meter works in Pali poetry, in Pali verse. It's long versus short vowels. And so there's no real mention of stress. There's no stress on stress in Pali pronunciation. It's just length and shortness of vowels. Like a common name for a Buddhist monk would be Vimala, whereas Vimala, it's like it's three short vowels. And so there's no stress at all. It's just Vimala. I mean, if you say it correctly, we English people, or people who speak English, you want to have a stress in there. And so some people will, like an American may just like mispronounce the name as Wimala or Vinya is like, I mean, it sounds like I'm putting the stress on the first syllable, which maybe I am accidentally, but there should be no stress at all in the word because every vowel is a short vowel. So in Pali, you got long vowels that have like the macron over the top. they have like the substitute for stress in English over a short vowel, which has no macron over the top. And then E, unless it's before a double consonant, is slightly longer than the usual long vowel. And O, unless it's before a double consonant, is the longest vowel. So O gets the most stress, but really it's just it takes the longest to say it. So my understanding of the pronunciation of Pali is that it's not really based on stress, that if any word has all vowels the same length, like mostly all short vowels, and no syllable in the word would receive any more stress than any other. So that's my answer, I guess. Yeah, I've heard that Greek was kind of like that too. Greek poetry, it's based more on length or shortness of vowels rather than stress. But I'm not. I mean, I'm no authority on Greek poetry. So I'll just move on to the next question. I hope Chakra Gosha doesn't feel betrayed by the shortness of my answer, considering the length of some of my other answers. But we got to move on. We got to get this done. So the next question is from the Arya Swasti Project. And the Arya Swasti Project says, "Greetings, Panyo. When I am consistently meditating and minding the precepts, it seems that things are different around me. Not that I'm just in a standard attitude adjustment, as in minding manners, driving the speed limit, etc., not to cause a stir, but that things occur differently. There sometimes seems to be an uncanny synchronicity happening. You could liken it to the humming a song in your head and then get in the car and it's playing on the radio sort of thing. We've all heard of that. The synchronicity is with very ordinary things, but in extraordinary order. I really don't think I'm crazy, nor am I trying to attribute fantasy to reality, and I loathe those who make connections where there are none to sound important or spiritual, etc. Can you tell me your thoughts on this? Warm regards, much respect, sadhu, sadhu, sadhu." Well, yeah, I have found in my own life that if you're doing intensive practice, especially, all kinds of weird coincidences can happen. Just synchronicity happens a lot, and it still happens a lot in my life, even though, as I've mentioned, I'm not doing formal sitting meditation anymore. But I mean, some people, especially my sweetheart, she can just be like weirded out or stunned, or because I'm continually saying something that she happens to be thinking. In fact, a few times she's like right, like beginning to say it, and I just out with it. And I mean, sometimes it's stuff. I mean, it's not like we're just. I mean, sometimes it's like something we're seeing on a YouTube video or something. But other times, I mean, we're just lying there silently, and then I'll just up with saying something off the wall, and then she's like, in a state of almost mild alarm because that's exactly what she was thinking about at the moment. And it's not that I have the psychic power of reading her mind. It's synchronicity. It's just I mean, I don't know. I guess Jung defines synchronicity as like a meaningful coincidence. So yeah, I mean, if you practice Dhamma, then just weird coincidences just keep happening. It might be that some of the miracles performed by saints, it's just the same thing. It's like they're at a higher level, and it's just they're not reading your mind necessarily. They'll just blurt out something, and it just happens to be what's in your mind. It's just weird coincidences. And I really do think that a lot of so-called miracles might be that way, where it's just the person, like the swami, the guru or whatever, they're not deliberately trying to do this. They're just doing what comes naturally, and it's just they're so in tune with the other person that there's kind of an us vibe going, at least in cases like this. And then it's sort of the us thoughts are coming out, which are kind of blowing the mind of the other members of the us group that are participating, although that might not account for all synchronicity. But in a way, if you're doing Dhamma practice, in a way you have more control over your surroundings in a way that you don't have full control over. It's hard to explain, but your karma is kind of in sync with your mind, and as your karma is also conditioning what's going on around you. So the more advanced you get in Dhamma practice, the more this kind of thing tends to happen. Or if you're just with a person who's very liminal and possibly very advanced, this sort of thing can happen too. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Rafi46. And Rafi46 says, the Buddha promised the besotted Nanda 500 celestial nymphs if he would stay a monk. Is a Buddhist who tries to avoid performing unwholesome karma only because he wants pleasure with celestial nymphs any different from a Muslim who lives a pious life on this earth only so he can do the opposite in paradise, like drinking and having sex with multiple virgins? Well, I could do a whole video on this one. For those of you unfamiliar with Theravada Buddhist lore, Nanda was the Buddha's half brother. And the Buddha did this thing. He's fully enlightened, allegedly. I mean, that's the working hypothesis or the firm belief of devout Buddhists. And on his wedding day, the Buddha lured him away from getting married by showing him what celestial nymphs look like. And then he persuaded Nanda to be ordained as a monk instead. So he jilted his fiance practically at the altar by showing him that, the Deva women, make human women look like monkeys by comparison, essentially. And it's kind of a dirty trick. I'm sure the fiance didn't like it much. But the thing is, Nanda, he was sort of, he liked girls apparently. And so the Buddha used that as what a Mahayana Buddhist would call skillful means to get him interested in becoming a monk. But then, as Nanda practiced diligently at first, so he can get the 500 celestial nymphs, regardless of his motives at the beginning, he was practicing correctly. He was under the tutorship, the tutelage. That's it. He was under the tutelage of an enlightened being, and so he's practicing correctly, and so his wisdom is progressing. And before long, his desire for the 500 celestial nymphs had evaporated, and he became fully enlightened. And it wasn't that the desire for the celestial nymphs evaporated at the moment of enlightenment. He had to leave that behind before he could ever get enlightened. So it's sort of like I was talking about earlier, where you can start off with not very good motives, but at least if the motives are getting you moving in the right direction, then as your insight and your wisdom improves, you'll be leaving those behind and getting better motives, essentially. So at first, it might be like the pious Muslim who just wants the dark-eyed houris. But if you're practicing correctly, practicing meditation, and your wisdom is increasing, then the wisdom of your motives will increase likewise. So I'll just move on to Rafi46. Next question. Buddhists often write online that they personally oppose abortion because it violates the precept against killing, but at the same time, they don't want that the state outlaws abortions because it is the woman's choice, and outlawing it would create a black market and make things worse. But now the same Buddhists favor a state which outlaws late-term abortions occurring from 21 weeks onward, without the mother's life being at risk. Wouldn't this be hypocrisy, since the Buddha didn't make a difference between an abortion some weeks after the fertilization and an abortion some weeks before giving birth? Well, this is kind of a surprisingly subtle question. I can just sort of give you my own take on my own attitude, in that from a Buddhist point of view, life does begin at conception. Buddhism and biology agree with this, that an individual organism's life begins as soon as the sperm and the egg come together. They create this new cell that has its own unique DNA sequences. And so that's it. It's alive. This little fertilized cell, this zygote, it's already alive. It's metabolizing. it's respiring, and then it grows until it becomes, a baby. But life began at conception. And according to Buddhism, you have to have the karmic stream at conception. So it's like the being who has taken rebirth, according to Theravada, takes rebirth at the moment of conception. So you've got like a being there, you've got like a human being there in sort of a elementary state, very primitive kind of, but still it is a human being. So I can accept that, but I also can accept that my religious beliefs, or some ethical principles, just because you think something is immoral doesn't necessarily mean that it should be illegal. So I'm kind of okay with some immoral things being legal. I don't want to be a complete Puritan and outlaw. And from a Buddhist point of view, even like singing and dancing are immoral. Not as immoral as killing a baby, but still, I mean, there have been cultures that have outlawed singing and dancing, and they were very neurotic, repressed kind of people. So, I mean, if you separate your religious beliefs with your political principles, religious principles are over here, political principles over here. I mean, they should be interacting to some degree. They should be sort of on speaking terms, but still, yeah, it is kind of complicated. But whether it would be hypocrisy or not, I mean, I guess that's the gist of this question. Wouldn't this be hypocrisy? It would depend on the individual and exactly what the thought process is. They're thinking that aborting a fetus from 21 weeks onward is just so immoral that you're going to have to step in. I mean, you have to draw the line somewhere. You can allow people to gamble and drink alcohol and sing and dance and tell lies sometimes. But I mean, you have to draw the line somewhere. Where you're going to draw the line between, this is just immoral, but I mean, it shouldn't be illegal, and this is so immoral that it should be illegal. So I think it might be a case of that in a lot of cases. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Arain. And Arain says, if karma from killing bugs and things is volitional in Buddhism, how about this scenario? You're a Buddhist and your puppy has worms. The worms are slowly feeding off the life force of your puppy and robbing it of nutrition, making it sickly and eventually leading to death. You cannot just purge the worms from your puppy. As part of the worm's life cycle is being purged into the soil, then returning back up into the host. How do you rid your puppy of worms as a Buddhist? Or do you simply do nothing and allow the puppy to die a slow death because you cannot intentionally kill the worms? In Southeast Asia, village dogs lead short, cruel lives by Western standards. So many basic things like this are hard for modern Westerners to grasp. Yeah, there's a lot to cover in this, actually. Yeah, as a monk living in tropical Asia, I mean, it's not just puppies; it's monks that get worms. I've had intestinal worms numerous times, and yeah, I remember one Korean monk. He was staying at this monastery. It was a rough monastery, and he used to be like a professional dancer, and he did not belong there at all. He was just freaking out when he was seeing little white worms in his poop. He was afraid of lizards and all kinds of things too. He left as soon as the rains retreat was over. He was out of there. But I digress. But I mean, I just took the worming medicine. I mean, it's like the purpose. The purpose is not to kill the worms. The purpose is just to get myself worm free. And going with that idea, it's allowable even for a monk to kill small animals. Like, for example, there was one time especially, it was right after a rainy spell, and the whole ground was just covered with these tiny little gnats, just countless myriads. I mean, you could not walk across the ground without squishing them. But still, I mean, I wasn't just going to be paralyzed. It's like I have to get from point A to point B. I have to walk over there. I got to get my hand into the camera here. Over there. So my purpose is not to squish bugs. I just gotta, I just gotta go there. So I went there and squished these bugs, and it wasn't against the rules because that was not my intention. So with worming your puppies, or worming yourself for that matter, well, I mean, that is your intention, is just to keep yourself healthy. You don't have any ill will. You don't hate the damn little worms. It's like, here, take this, worms. I'm taking poison to kill you, little bastards. It's not like that. It's just I gotta be healthy, and so you can do that if you have certain mental states. I mean, you're not doing it in order to kill living beings. You're just doing it in order to be healthy, or for your puppy to be healthy. So that would be allowable. Some monks in Burma, they'll eat like papaya seeds or something like that. That supposedly just the worms don't like it, and so they abandon ship. But still, I mean, once they leave the host body, they're pretty much in trouble, unless maybe they just get pooped into like a cesspit, and then they're just living in this paradise of poop for the rest of their lives or something. I don't know. But at another level, I mean, the necessity of doing this kind of stuff is one reason why monks are supposed to just renounce the world and have no family ties and not keep pets, that kind of a thing. Because if you're going to just be like totally hardcore, not going to kill any living beings if you can possibly help it, just radical ahimsa, then yeah, you pretty much have to be like a renunciant and renounce the world. If you've got kids, with lice, or they come home from school with head lice, or they've got pinworms or something, I mean, it's your duty to your children much more than it's your duty to the parasites. So you just have to kind of take the hit sometimes. You just have to have ranked priorities, so to speak. So, but it's true that Southeast Asian village dogs, a 4-year-old dog in Southeast Asia in a village is an old dog. Yeah, it's almost like a hell realm. Getting back to the question way up above on the scroll, that there are hell realms in this world, and a scroungy, mangy Southeast Asian village dog is in kind of a hell realm. I'll restrain the urge to give the mangy dog simile given in the texts, but well, I don't know. What the hell? This brevity is just not an option in this video. But there is a sutta, I can't remember which one, where the Buddha compares the average worldling, the average person immersed in samsara, with a mangy dog. And the dog is just, it can't be comfortable. It's just, just eaten alive with itchiness. And so it lies down on this side, and that doesn't help. So it scratches itself. That doesn't help. It lies down on the other side. That doesn't help. It gets up and moves over there, still itches. And it's just like in this state of chronic unease because it just can't get comfortable. And I mean, that's kind of the way the average human is to some degree in this world. It's just this restless, dissatisfied urge to just, more and more and more. But getting back to Arian's question, yeah, so long as your intention is not to kill, then you can take the dewormer and just don't think about it. In a way, it's sometimes being unmindful can save you from offenses. I've noticed that as a monk. Some rules, you can only break them if you do it consciously and deliberately. So if you just do it mindlessly, you're not breaking the rule. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Aurelian, one of my favorite emperors, by the way. And Aurelian says, what are your thoughts on outreach or incorporation of neo-pagans into the wider Navakavada-based Buddhist community? It occurs to me that there is a lot of masculine energy in many pagan circles, but without fleshed out theology, many can resort to larpery, cooking up their own personal beliefs or moving on to other religious systems, perhaps emphasizing the Indo-Europeans' roots and incorporating pagan elements in an appropriate form. Thor as Dhamma protector can help bring more people into a bigger tent and give an overall theological framework for disparate spiritual dissidents. Is there merit in this, or do you find a stripped down iconoclastic Zen-like approach more appropriate in modern America? Well, even Zen has its pantheon of gods and so forth. Um, some Zen Buddhists put more emphasis on that than others. The problem with the modern West, or the postmodern West, of course, is that we really don't have much paganism that's still existing other than as like replicas or larpery, as Aurelian here puts it. I mean, if we had an established pagan tradition, then I don't think it would be very difficult to combine that with Buddhism to some degree. Like when the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, when Alexander the Great conquered northwest India, and then northwest India for hundreds of years, that general area was under Greek control. Then a lot of the Greeks, the pagan, polytheist Greeks, converted to Buddhism, but like on their coins, they'd have like the Buddha on one side of the coin and Athena, the goddess of wisdom, on the other side of the coin. So, I mean, it has happened, and it does happen. The Burmese had their own polytheistic cult, the Nat cult, that got incorporated into Buddhism largely by adopting Saka, the king of Tawatimsa heaven, the king of gods in Tawatimsa heaven. He became the leader of these gods that the Burmese, before they converted to Buddhism, were worshiping. So yeah, it can happen, but the thing is, in the West, there's really not much of a pagan tradition left. We've kind of touched on this a little earlier on in this video. It might be better to try and combine it with some kind of philosophical system, neo-stoicism or something. That might work also. But if any kind of pagan system catches traction, Buddhism freely admits the existence of gods. It doesn't deny the existence of small g gods, devas and brahmas. So, I mean, you can incorporate it. I mean, if Buddhism admits that there are these small g gods, that aren't the creator God with a capital G, but still they do exist, then, I mean, any kind of polytheistic pantheon can get its foot in the door in Buddhism, and there can be sort of a merging where you adopt Buddhist principles, but some of the devas that you're discussing have pagan names, non-Buddhist names. I mean, I don't see any problem with that. I mean, it wouldn't necessarily even be deleterious to the Buddhism involved. But the thing is, in the West, you really don't have much of a pagan system, and what there is, it's not deep rooted and indigenous to the extent that, I mean, people are just. I assume there are polytheistic pagans alive today in the West that really sincerely worship Thor or Hera or Athena or whatever, and Isis, ancient Egyptian gods maybe, but there's something that just kind of rings false to me with regard to a lot of what's going on, where it's just kind of a replica. People are just wanting to create this thing that they themselves are kind of pretending at. But if there is any kind of authentic, genuine system that is polytheistic, and it doesn't have the moral principles that are at variance with Buddhism, then yeah, they can fit together. But I think in the West, it might be better to be more Zen-like, or try and incorporate some kind of like Western philosophical approach. But the way it's going now with sort of the nutty lefties, just turning it into a kind of atheistic, or not even atheistic, just not much spirituality, and it's mostly just leftist talking points kind of stuff. It's yeah, I mean, we need something better than that. So I'll just move on to Aurelian's next question. And Aurelian's next question, this is an easy one. This is kind of a refreshingly easy question. Do your current acquaintances ever ask you to go hunting or fishing? How would you respond to such requests? Not once. Nobody. Well, I was kind of like a cosmic cowboy, pacifist hippie before I was a monk. So even before I was a monk, my buddies, some of whom really liked hunting and fishing, even they knew that they would not to ask me. I still have a few friends who hunt or fish, but they'll tell me what they got. We got a 4-point buck the other, during deer season or something. It's like, oh, okay, but yeah, they don't ask me. So yeah, I'd probably politely decline if they invited me. So I'll just move on to the next question. Also from Aurelian. You often mention Kwai Chang Caine, and it seems as if the Kung Fu series supplied you with early inspiration and perhaps a role model in your younger days. Do you like any other martial arts programs, perhaps old Shaw Brothers films like 36th Chamber of the Shaolin? Well, it is true that when I was a kid, I liked the series Kung Fu. That was one of my first exposures to Buddhist monasticism, especially in the flashbacks when he's back at the Shaolin Temple. But I mostly watched it for the Buddhism part and not so much for the martial arts. Um, yeah, I mean, when I was in Burma, especially like riding buses from Upper Burma down to Rangoon, sometimes you get some Chinese wire fu movie. I've watched some Chinese martial arts movies. My hero is one that with Jet Li, I think, that was relatively well known in the West. Um, so I mean, I'm watching Jackie Chan or something, but it's I didn't get any kind of spiritual instruction from it or anything like that. The whole Kwai Chang Caine thing, it really struck me more deeply than like a Chinese wire fu movie. And I've never really seen any serious attempt at like a Buddhist philosophical movie that just happens to be based on like Shaolin monks or anything like that. I'm sure they're out there. I just haven't seen them. So I'll just move on to Aurelian's next and last question, which is, if hypothetically a global order came down that Abrahamism would be the one world religion on pain of death or gulag, what Abrahamist sect would you grudgingly join or off to the gulag to meditate? Well, that's kind of a difficult question to answer because I mean it would depend on the circumstances and it would depend on what how religious you'd have to be in order to be one of these religions, a member of one of these religions. It's possible I just go to the gulag, but if I had to choose an Abrahamist religion, I really can sort of resonate to some degree with Catholicism, some aspects of it, just because it does have some Western classical paganism mixed in, and some Catholic saints in the past, like Saint John of the Cross, that I'm continually bringing up. I mean, I think it's possible he may have been fully enlightened. I just can't believe the story, like Jesus dying for our sins and the stuff about Mary, the Virgin Mother of God, and let alone the like Genesis with a man made out of dirt and a woman made out of a bone being tricked by a snake and eating the wrong kind of fruit, thereby causing all the suffering in the world, and Jesus coming here to get us off the hook for that. Yeah, I mean, just with regard to what the what it requires you to believe, it'd be easier for me to be a Muslim because in Islam, pretty much all there is God is one God and Muhammad is his prophet. I mean that might be sufficient, and then I could be a Sufi or something. So yeah, I'd either be the Gulag or maybe I'd become a Sufi if being a Sufi was allowable. But Allah is one God and Muhammad is his prophet. I mean, if all you got to do is essentially believe that and do the bows to Mecca and so forth, then that might not be too obtrusive. In fact, I mean, I really hope that the world doesn't become mandatory Muslim, but I think if there was, I mean, if the West did become Islamic, it'd probably be better than what's going on now. At least it has the potential to become better than cultural Marxist, just spiritually bankrupt moral degeneracy with some feminine sentiment thrown in to masquerade as a moral high ground. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Me and Me, who is a new donor on Subscribestar. I guess I should follow my subscriber or sponsor, which is appreciated. And Me says, in martial arts, there is an energy transfer between opponents when they fight or practice. There is also something called direct energy transmission in the Chinese healing arts. These instances mean energy or knowledge is transferred to the receiver. This is pretty well known among people, I think, so I will also assume you know this. We also all know that there are people out there that probably use such understanding to manipulate things, maybe in different religions, but here I am wondering about this scenario. Do you think an energy transfer can happen between a master meditator martial artist and another person strictly through energy in some kind of meditation? The martial artist part, I think, is unnecessary, especially if it's in some kind of meditation. Or maybe Me and Me is asking whether a martial artist meditator could actually like fight somebody through meditation, just through mental energies, just directing, intimidating energies to make them back off or something. Yeah, I don't fully understand this question, although, gosh, I haven't even read the whole question. I'll just keep going here. If two people are in the same energetic field, like partners, they can creep into each other's energetic field or body, both positively and negatively. So if persons in this similar type of field together have their personal connection, do you think it is possible for one to force their energy into the other's field or even body if one is weak enough through meditation? Have you ever heard of any monks or Buddhists doing this or something like this, or manipulating energy to others due to their understandings in meditations? Yeah, the actual meditation part is in a way kind of unnecessary, because I mean, two people, mental states are contagious, and a person with a strong mind is gonna kind of, in a way, overwhelm the mental states of a person with a weak mind if they're interacting, especially if the person with a strong mind is deliberately trying to impose his will. And meditation can like refine that, make it stronger maybe, or it also make it more subtle. I mean, you'd be less violent if you're a meditator, supposedly. So yeah, mental states are contagious, and the stronger person may have the advantage in just having more of a vote with regard to what the us will be doing, or what kind of state the us will be in, because when two people interact, there's always like this third being that is an us. And if two people love each other deeply, they're having a relationship that can be really strong, just really a strong presence there, although in most cases it's kind of faint and subliminal, but still it's there. And man, this is such a long question here. Do you think it possible for one to force their energy into another's field or even body if one is weak enough? Yeah, I think that happens. I mean, just about everybody has done things they didn't want to do just because of somebody else wanting them to do it. Like a good salesman, like an aggressive salesperson, can get people to buy stuff that when they're walking out with it, they might be regretting having bought the things. They just kind of knuckle under the pressure or something. I mean, I've done that before. I've never been much of a consumer, but people at one particular time, I won't go into details, but they sold me something that it's like I just kind of like kind of embarrassed not to pay for it. So I just paid the money and got out of there. That was a long time ago. But that kind of thing can happen. I think some politicians, like the really charismatic orators, can really impose their will on entire crowds or even populations. But that, I mean, somebody like Adolf Hitler wasn't a meditator, not that I'm aware of, not in this life anyway. So it may be that some meditators are like, they're meditating for the purpose of that. It's not like right concentration. It's not wholesome, I suppose. But yeah, I'm sure that like maybe in some kind of Tibetan Buddhism, that kind of thing happens. Like Milarepa started off as a kind of sorcerer. So, I mean, you could use meditation as a way of strengthening your sorcery skills or some such. But that kind of leads to this next question by me and me. So I'll just go on to the next question. I'm sorry, it was kind of a difficult question for me to answer. But I think this next one is sort of along the same lines. So me and me also asks, do you think Buddhist sects practice magic without realizing it? If this is actually true, where would they be and how would you know if you entered one such place? Would you feel it is not very pure or something is wrong? Well, it depends on what kind of magic they're practicing. I mean, if they're doing white magic, then yeah, there are sorcerers in Burma. Some of them are monks that do white magic, and also there are some who are accused, at least, of doing black magic. There was a relatively famous Sayadaw in Burma who was accused of being a necromancer, like controlling the spirits of the dead and that kind of a thing. But I mean, you wouldn't know it by just meeting him, or unless you were like really super sensitive, maybe. I didn't notice anything like creepy or spooky about him. I met him personally a few times. Let's see. So, I mean, there are like in Southeast Asia, there are monasteries where they are practicing alchemy and also some kinds of white magic. Probably some monks out there doing black magic too. So I think you'd know it if you entered to such a place, not just from the vibe so much as just seeing the paraphernalia on the altars, or just take a good look around. You're seeing any weird paraphernalia, like the weird bells or whatever that sorcerers might use. That would probably be a better indication. And would you feel it is not very pure or something? It would depend on the mental states of the monks there. I mean, if they're like really in some kind of evil mental state, you could pick up on that if you got any sensitivity or empathy. But I mean, if they're doing white magic or they're just doing spells for, getting a deva to like heal some sick baby or something, yeah. But it may be that me and me is referring to this kind of magic as imposing one's mental states upon somebody else, and I haven't really heard of that. I'm sure it happens. I mean, just anything you can think of, it's going to be somebody doing it. But yeah, as a general rule, Theravada Buddhist monks are pretty mild. It's mild to the point of just being excruciatingly boring in many cases. I mean, most Theravada Buddhist monks, if you watch YouTube videos and so forth, they tend to be pretty boring. They're just dry, and it makes sense really if you think about it, because they're trying to like phase out. They're just trying to fade out of existence, and so it's like the more boring you get, the closer you are to nibbana or something. So yeah, it happens, but and there are like alchemical schools and monasteries in Burma, and by schools I mean like a sect, not like an institution where you go there and get trained or something. And I'm sure that there are like monks practicing necromancy and that sort of thing, but to actually imposing their will and like manipulating people and so forth, um, I don't know. I mean, there are like famous rich monks who will use their charisma and just the awe that they inspire as a way of getting donations out of people. But I don't think that's what me and me is referring to here. So I'll just move on to me and me's next question. which is, what do you know about the birthplace of the Buddha? Well, it's well established in the Theravada Buddhist text that the Buddha was born in the city or near the city of Kapilavatthu, which would be, most scholars would agree that it's now in what would now be southern Nepal, which was, within the sphere of Indian culture at the time. So I guess it's called Lumbini in modern times. There's a Ashokan pillar there commemorating the birth of the Buddha there. It may be that tradition is mistaken and he was really born somewhere else. Like I consider it to be a mistake in Christian tradition that the Buddha or that the Jesus was born in Bethlehem. I think he's probably more likely born up around Galilee. But the Old Testament prophecies that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem required the, uh, the composers of the Gospels to monkey with the details a bit and somehow have him born in Bethlehem, even though everyone knew he came from Galilee. So it could be that something like that happened with the Buddha also, but tradition is well established that he was born in the city-state of Kapilavatthu, which was a kind of it was ruled by an oligarchy, or like the kshatriya men of the upper classes formed like a council that ruled Kapilavatthu, although tradition has gotten the Buddha the son of a king, the king of Kapilavatthu, although I think the archaeologists and the Indologists would say that really Kapilavatthu wasn't a kingdom. It was kind of like an oligarchic aristocracy. It was just the ruling class together, sort of like the patricians of early Rome. But then in order to try to combine the two, they'll say, well, he was the leader of the aristocracy, which made him like a king, or practically a king or something. So I think I answered that one. Kapilavatthu, which I believe was in southern Nepal, and it just got wiped out. I mean, it got genocided just not very long after the Buddha died. And there's kind of a long story about some king getting deceived and being sent a servant girl instead of a princess from there, and getting mad and sending his army and just killing everybody and so forth. But let's just move on to the next question. This is also from Me and Me. And Me and Me says, if good-natured Buddhists get ripped apart from the tyranny of governments or such types, such as what has happened in Tibet or other places, how would you equate that to their karma? If karma is a mental state, for example, maybe they are a bit naive. Let's see, how would you equate that to their karma? Question mark. If karma is a mental state, period. For example, maybe they are a bit naive. I would think they would know if something is coming and try to run and hide or protect themselves, or do they really just take it because of their Buddhism? I was told a story and confirmed by a monk that they would just take it if they got attacked or even killed. Not to say they would really do that in real life. Maybe instinct would take over. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing immoral about running away from murderers. I mean, obviously, if you can't overpower them or defend yourself against them, just run. Like when the Turkish Muslims invaded India, I mean, it was just a massive genocide, one of the greatest genocides in history. I've seen figures up around 30 million Indian Buddhists were killed. And I mean, some of them were just killed because they refused to convert to Islam. Some of them ran away. Some of them after they ran away just like starved or died of exposure or whatever. Or some of them converted. And now there's not very much Buddhism in India anymore. So yeah, I mean the really serious ones, I mean they'd rather die than like fight back. And that's one reason why Buddhism got wiped out in India, but Hinduism didn't, because Hinduism still had some like military ideals, like like the Bhagavad Gita takes place on a battlefield, or like the Ramayana, like the two great epics of Indian poetry, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, both of them have a lot of like battles and fighting and stuff going on. Krishna, who was an avatar of Vishnu, I mean, he was a fighter. So they did have that in their tradition that kind of, encouraged them to fight back against the Muslims. Whereas the Buddhists said they're just uncompromising pacifists. Some of them were willing to just take the hit. Some of them just ran away. Others converted, just because human nature can be weak, especially in some people, and they'd prefer to stay alive than die with dignity, or maybe even undignified if they're being burned alive or something. So, yeah, it depends on the individual, and it would be an individual choice. So, the next question, which is the last question from me, and that is fun for 5. How do you like the rapid changing West in the US? If you could collect everyone, I mean everyone, together and think about their karma, what is going on in that mind, or what do you think will happen? Well, that's kind of a tough one. I mean, collect everyone together and think about their karma. It's like each person has their own karma. There's obviously similarities and overlap because some of the same general things are happening to pretty much everybody. So there are certain themes and similarities, but still, I mean, everybody's got their own karma. What do I think will happen, or what is going on in the karma of the people, and what do I think will happen? Well, I'm not sure what's going to happen. What's going on in the mind? I think partly what is happening, why things are so weird. One of the reasons why things are so weird in the West now is that partly technology is changing very fast, and also you've got progressivism, so-called, as though decline and fall were progress, that is like trying to uproot all the traditions and replace it with this new, hyper liberalism or cultural Marxism or progressivism, whatever you want to call it. And it's just, people are losing their roots. It's like they're losing the law and order, the structure, sort of the culturally established social structure that kind of kept everything more or less predictable. That and of course technology, like I mentioned. So things are changing, and it's becoming unstable and very liminal, and just things are just happening in very weird ways, and things are changing faster and faster. And it's I mean, it's practically a singularity now. It's you can't really predict what's going to happen. You just have to just kind of watch, observe carefully, because I mean, whether the globalists, the globalist establishment is going to just lock down control and just set up the brave new world order, or whether there's going to be enough resistance to that something else, moving back in the other direction, a little more traditionalist, with a little more, established, sensible, tried and true, like structure is reestablished, that kind of settles things down again. But right now, it's the roots are being torn up, and the stakes are getting pulled up, and everything's in disarray, and everything's changing so fast, and so it's just it's becoming liminal, and all just anything can happen now. It's it's much more difficult than predicting the weather. What's going to happen. It could just take one little thing, just one charismatic leader to arise on one side or the other to just take the whole thing in that direction. You really can't say. But I do tend to have a certain amount of faith in my karma, that I doubt that any. I mean, it's not going to be much worse than a cyberpunk dystopia. Yeah, I really have enough faith in my own destiny, I think, that it's not going to be just a total horrible mess. Of course, some people would say it's already a total horrible mess, but it could be a lot worse than it is now. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from BPAT427. And BPAT427 says, how would you compare the temperament of Washington residents to that of South Carolinians? Well, Golly, that's kind of an interesting question. And by Washington, he's not talking about Washington, D.C., he's talking about Washington State, where I grew up and where I first tried to live as a monk after coming back from Burma in 2011 with kind of ambivalent results. Um, gee, well, South Carolinians tend to be more conservative. They're more Christian, more likely to go to church. Um, the people in Washington were more Democrat. People in South Carolina are more Republican. I think that would be like one of the most obvious things. Things are slower paced in South Carolina. I mean, you can be stuck in a checkout line behind somebody who's just having this long conversation with the checker. He's talking about his dog back at home or something. Um, I mean, there's much better traffic discipline in Washington State, if I remember correctly, than in South Carolina. Like where I'm living now, maybe half of the people actually use their turn signals, which I was told is due to a shortage of blinker fluid, but I'm kind of skeptical of that. But I mean, people are people, and Americans are Americans, and there's way more similarities and differences in most respects. Yeah, I think I'm more comfortable in South Carolina now just because the left has just left me behind. I was kind of a long-haired hippie type when I was young in Washington State, um, but now the left has just gone insane, as far as I can tell. So there's more of that insanity in Washington than in South Carolina, but it's more of a city thing. I mean, you go to like a college town, like a big city, with sort of a left leaning university, which most universities are, and it's going to like the countryside in Washington more closely resembles the countryside in South Carolina than it does Seattle. So yeah, it depends on where you are in each state, but overall, South Carolina is just more easygoing and slow paced and more accepting of people, more polite. People are just like really friendly, blessing each other and stuff. Customers at work, I load something onto their truck with a forklift. Says, you have a blessed day. There's just, and it's the pleasantries aren't just superficial, and the smiles aren't just superficial like you'd get in like Seattle, for example. But I mean, again, it's just slight differences. It's not anything really radical. And so finally, at long last, the last question of the whole Q&A. This is also from BPAT 427, and this is kind of an anticlimax because I've already answered this question above. BPAT 427 says, do you currently have a formal sitting practice? And I do not. I'm not sure how long I could sit in the full lotus anymore. I used to always sit in the full lotus, and I haven't sat in the full lotus for more than just a few minutes in a very long time. So, like I said, I got as far as I could with formal sitting practice. Even as a monk practicing hours a day, I just got to this point where I just was not making progress anymore. And it lasted for years. And so finally, I just said, well, I need to try something else. I mean, if you're doing something for years and it's not working anymore, at least you're not getting any better at it. You're not making progress with it. Then it's time to try something else. So I'm trying something else. I'm doing the ascetic practices of a layman, and I'm involved in a relationship, which means that I have helped to create a third being called us. And I hope I'm still making progress. I mean, obviously, it's very different. I'm dealing with very different situations than I used to when I was living alone in a cave in a forest. So in a way, I'm kind of like Kwai Chang Caine, speak of the devil, who was, he leaves behind the monastery and he's in the Wild West, getting shot at by cowboys and so forth. Although I'm not getting shot at by cowboys. And that's the last question. So I think we're done, other than just the little bit of advice here that if you have any questions about anything you think I might know something about, particularly Buddhism or monasticism or the Pali language or meditation or me personally or life in Southeast Asia, anything like that, feel free to leave a question in the comments below. If you're a subscriber on Subscribestar, you can leave your comments there. If you have access to the Discord server, you can leave your questions there. And look at the links below, which has all the relevant information, including the links to my books on Amazon. And be happy.